John had been working as a mailman in the quiet suburban neighborhood for several years. Every morning, he would walk down the same peaceful streets, delivering letters and packages to all the familiar houses. He had come to know the people in his road quite well, many of them greeting him with a friendly wave or a few words about the weather. But there was one house that stood out in his mind, the house of Mrs. Andrews, an elderly woman who lived alone. Mrs. Andrews was a gentle soul. John had delivered mail to her for years, and every time he stopped by, she would smile warmly and chat with him for a few minutes. She always looked well put together, wearing neat clothes, and her home was always tidy. John had grown fond of her over time. She was kind, and it was clear that she took pride in her independence. Despite her age, she would often be seen out in the garden, trimming flowers or tidying up the yard. The neighborhood loved her, and John often thought that if anyone had the perfect life, it was Mrs. Andrews. But one day, as John approached her house during his usual route, he noticed something unusual. Mrs. Andrews was outside, just as she always was, but there was something off about her today. As she took the mail from his hands, John noticed stains on her pants. It wasn't something he had seen before. He had always admired how neat and proper she appeared, so it was unusual for her to be wearing clothes with such noticeable stains. At first, he thought it might be nothing. Perhaps she had accidentally spilled something while making tea or working in the garden. But as he looked closer, he noticed something more disturbing. Mrs. Andrews wasn't smiling like she usually did. Instead, her face seemed a little tired, and there was an unfamiliar, distant look in her eyes. She didn't ask about the weather, nor did she seem as alert as usual. Normally, she would have asked how John was doing or commented on the latest neighborhood gossip. But today, she just stood there quietly. John paused for a moment, uncertain. It was just a small thing, he told himself. She was probably just tired or had a rough morning. But something inside him made him look at her more carefully. He had delivered mail to Mrs. Andrews for so long, and in all that time, he had never seen her like this. He watched as she slowly walked back into the house, her movements slower than he had ever seen. Curious, John took a quick glance inside the open door as she entered. He didn't see anything alarming at first, just the usual neat living room. But there was something unsettling about the way the house felt at that moment. It was unusually quiet. Normally, you could hear the soft hum of a television or the sound of footsteps echoing from within. But now, it felt still, too still. John didn't know why, but he felt an uneasy knot in his stomach. Something about this encounter didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was just the way Mrs. Andrews looked today, or maybe it was the way the house seemed to hold its breath in the silence. Whatever it was, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next day, John was back on his usual route, walking the same quiet streets as he always did. He had hoped that the strange feeling he'd had the day before was just a passing thought, something that came with the routine of his job. But as he approached Mrs. Andrews' house again, that uneasy feeling returned. There she was, standing at the door, just like before. John tried to ignore the thoughts that ran through his mind as he walked up to her. But today, the stains on her pants were even more noticeable. They were darker now and more pronounced than the day before. The sight of them sent a ripple of discomfort through him. Mrs. Andrews didn't seem to notice his gaze, and she took the mail from him with her usual politeness. But something about her seemed different. She didn't greet him with her usual bright smile, nor did she seem eager to chat. John handed her the package, hoping that she might offer a few words, something to reassure him that everything was fine. But she simply nodded and stepped back into the house without saying a word. He couldn't help but notice how slow her movements were. There was a heaviness to the way she carried herself, like every step took more effort than it should have. A sense of worry crept into John's mind. He had always admired how independent Mrs. Andrews was, but today she seemed fragile. There was a tiredness in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, a kind of weariness that spoke volumes. She had always been sharp, her mind quick and alert, But today she seemed to be somewhere far away, lost in thought, or perhaps in discomfort. John's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer as he tried to figure out what could be wrong. He looked past her at the house, and that strange feeling in his stomach returned. The house was just as quiet as it had been the day before. The curtains were drawn, the lights dimmed, and there was no sound of activity. The stillness of the house made him uneasy, like something was out of place, though he couldn't put his finger on it. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should check in on her, but he quickly dismissed the thought. After all, Mrs. Andrews had always been capable and strong, and she didn't need anyone checking on her, or so he told himself. But even as he stood there, his gut told him otherwise. Something about this didn't feel right. John tried to shake off his growing concern. Maybe she was just tired, or perhaps it was just a bad day for her. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. It wasn't just the stains or the way she moved. It was the overall sense of quiet in the house, the way everything seemed to be at a standstill. He glanced at the door once more, almost as if hoping for a sign that everything was okay. But as he turned to leave, the feeling lingered in the back of his mind. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it. He knew that if he did, he might regret it later. John wasn't sure what exactly he was feeling, but deep down, he knew he needed to act, even if he didn't fully understand why. The next morning, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had hoped that yesterday's concerns were just his imagination, but the unease lingered in the back of his mind. As he walked up the familiar street, he found himself glancing at Mrs. Andrews' house before he even reached her doorstep. This time, he couldn't help but wonder if he was being overly cautious, but that nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. When he arrived at the house, he noticed Mrs. Andrews was standing by her door again, just as she had the past few days. Her posture was slumped, her back a little more hunched than usual. As she reached out to take the mail, John saw that the stains on her pants were still there, and they seemed even more pronounced today. He couldn't tell what they were from. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but it was unsettling. "Good morning, Mrs. Andrews," John said, trying to sound as casual as possible. But as soon as the words left his mouth, he knew something wasn't right. She didn't respond with her usual warmth. She didn't even smile. She just took the mail from him with slow, deliberate movements, as if each action required an enormous amount of effort. She seemed almost disconnected. There was something distant in her eyes that John hadn't seen before, and it worried him. Normally, Mrs. Andrews was a sharp and lively woman, always interested in hearing about the latest happenings in the neighborhood, offering a laugh or two about the quirky goings-on around town. But today there was no spark in her eyes, no enthusiasm. She seemed more like a shell of the person he had known. John tried to push the unease aside, but it clung to him like a shadow. As Mrs. Andrews turned to walk back into the house, John noticed how slowly she moved. There was no briskness in her step. It was as if she was dragging herself along, struggling with every movement. The sight made him uneasy. It was hard to believe that this was the same woman who, just a few months ago, had been out in the garden, tending to her flowers with energy and grace. The door to her house was slightly ajar, and John could see inside. His heart skipped a beat when he noticed that the house was eerily quiet again. Normally, he could hear the faint sounds of a television or a radio, maybe even the rustle of Mrs. Andrews walking around. But today, there was nothing. It felt wrong, like a vacuum of silence. The stillness made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. John stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty doorway. He knew he shouldn't be standing there, lingering. He was just the mailman, after all. But something told him he couldn't walk away. He couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he looked back at Mrs. Andrews, who had barely acknowledged his presence, the thought crossed his mind. Maybe she needed help. Maybe she had been hiding it for a while, not wanting anyone to worry. John shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do next. Should he go inside? Should he call someone? He didn't know what the right thing to do was, but he knew he couldn't leave her like this. He had been delivering her mail for years, and he had always been the one to chat with her for a few moments, to exchange pleasantries. Now, everything felt different. It was as if he was standing at the edge of something important, but he wasn't sure if he should step forward. The feeling in his gut told him that he couldn't just walk away this time. He had to act. John walked away from Mrs. Andrews' house, but the feeling of unease still clung to him. The streets were quiet as he made his way down the block, but his thoughts weren't on his deliveries. All he could think about was the way Mrs. Andrews had looked that morning. The strange stains on her pants, the distant expression in her eyes, the slow, labored way she moved. It wasn't like her. Not at all. He had seen her go from being the active, independent woman who always had something to say to someone who now appeared fragile and withdrawn. John couldn't ignore it. He couldn't just chalk it up to old age or a bad day. There was something deeper at play here, something more serious than she was letting on. As he continued down the street, his thoughts kept returning to the house. He wondered if he should have said something when he saw her looking so weak. Maybe he should have asked if she needed help. But then again, Mrs. Andrews was fiercely independent. She would never have accepted help from anyone, not unless she absolutely had to. She was the kind of person who would smile through her pain and carry on without asking for assistance. That's just who she was. She had always prided herself on doing things on her own. And that's what John had admired about her. But now, there was no denying that something wasn't right. John knew he had seen enough to understand that. He didn't know exactly what was wrong, but the way she had looked, so worn out and unwell, made his heart heavy with concern. What if she had been hiding it for weeks, too proud or too stubborn to ask for help? What if she needed medical attention and had been struggling alone for days? John couldn't shake the thought of her alone in that house, suffering in silence. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. For the first time, he began to regret not having said anything earlier. He couldn't just pretend like everything was fine. He couldn't let this go. His mind raced as he continued his walk. He thought about calling someone. A family member, maybe, or a neighbor. But would that even help? What if it was too late by then? What if she needed immediate attention? The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that something needed to be done now. He couldn't wait for someone else to notice or take action. He was the one who saw her every day. He was the one who had noticed the changes, the signs that something wasn't right. John stopped in his tracks, his hand on the handle of the next house's mailbox. He took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had to do something. He couldn't just keep walking by, pretending everything was okay when he knew deep down that it wasn't. His mind was made up. He had to act. With determination, John pulled out his phone and dialed 911. His voice was steady, but he couldn't help the hint of concern in his words as he explained the situation. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know exactly what was wrong with Mrs. Andrews, but he knew she needed help. The dispatcher on the other end of the line assured him that help would be on the way. As he hung up the phone, John felt a small sense of relief wash over him. He had done what he could. Now he could only hope that it wasn't too late. John stood by the side of the street, his mind still spinning with thoughts of Mrs. Andrews. The moment he had made the decision to call 911, a wave of both relief and anxiety washed over him. Relief because he had taken action, but anxiety because he still didn't know what kind of situation he was sending help into. All he could do now was wait and hope he hadn't overreacted. He looked back at Mrs. Andrews' house, the windows now dark, as if the world inside had frozen in time. The silence of the house unnerved him. There was no movement, no sign of life. It made the knot in his stomach tighten. What if she had been alone all night? What if she had been too proud to call for help, thinking she could handle it herself? His mind raced with the worst possible scenarios, each one making him more worried. John kept glancing toward the house, trying to see any movement through the windows. He had been delivering her mail for so long, and it felt like he should have known something was wrong earlier. Maybe he should have asked her more questions that morning, maybe insisted that she let him help her. But it was too late for that now. He could still see her face in his mind. Her tired eyes, the slow shuffle of her feet as she moved into her home, the way she had avoided making eye contact with him. It was as if she was hiding something. John had a sense of guilt building inside him, even though he knew he had done the right thing by calling for help. He just wished there had been more he could have done sooner. Time seemed to drag as John waited. Every minute felt like an eternity, each passing second heavier than the last. His thoughts kept returning to Mrs. Andrews. He had seen her every day for years, and now he was worried he might have lost her without even realizing it. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he wished he could have done more to prevent this moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief surged through him, but it was tinged with nervousness. The flashing lights of the ambulance soon came into view, and John's heart raced as he watched the paramedics pull up to the curb in front of Mrs. Andrews' house. He could see them quickly stepping out of the vehicle, pulling equipment from the back, ready to rush inside. John felt a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to follow them inside, to know exactly what was happening, to make sure everything would be okay. But he knew he couldn't interfere. This wasn't his place. His job had been to recognize that something was wrong and get the help that was needed. The rest was out of his hands. The paramedics moved quickly, but John stayed back, watching from a distance. His mind was still racing, but he focused on the hope that Mrs. Andrews would be okay, that his call for help had been the right thing to do. He watched as the paramedics knocked on the door, and when it opened, they went inside with urgency. He couldn't hear anything from where he stood, but he felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. The decision had been made, and now there was nothing more he could do. All he could do was wait for the outcome, for the news that would tell him if Mrs. Andrews had gotten the help she needed in time. John stood at a distance, his eyes fixed on Mrs. Andrews' house. The sirens had faded away into the background, and the quiet was almost unbearable. He paced nervously on the sidewalk, his thoughts still racing, hoping that the paramedics were inside, doing everything they could to help her. Every time he glanced back toward the house, his heart skipped a beat. He was torn between wanting to know what was happening and feeling like he shouldn't intrude. All he could do now was wait. Minutes felt like hours as he watched the paramedics move in and out of the house. He couldn't see much from where he was standing, but the fact that they were still inside gave him hope. Maybe, just maybe, Mrs. Andrews was going to be okay. He tried to stay calm, reminding himself that he had done everything he could. He had made the call. He had trusted that the right people would arrive to take care of her. But still, the worry gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the fear that it might be too late. After a while, one of the paramedics emerged from the house. John immediately felt a wave of relief flood through him. The paramedic, a woman with short brown hair and a focused expression, walked over to the ambulance, carrying a medical kit. She seemed to be deep in thought, her eyes scanning the area as if calculating the next step. As she passed by, John couldn't help but ask, "Is she okay?" The paramedic glanced at him and gave a reassuring nod. "She's stable for now. We've got her on oxygen, and we're going to take her to the hospital to run some tests. It looks like she's had a stroke, but it's hard to say how long she's been like this. You did the right thing by calling us. It's a good thing we got here when we did." John's heart dropped as the words sank in. A stroke. He had feared it might be something serious, but hearing the confirmation made everything feel so much more real. He felt a mix of relief that Mrs. Andrews had been found in time, but also a deep sense of guilt. What if she had been alone for longer than he knew? What if he hadn't noticed the signs? He wished he had done something sooner, something more than just delivering the mail every day. The paramedic must have sensed his discomfort because she gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't blame yourself. You were the one who saw something wasn't right. That's why we're here now, and she'll get the care she needs." John nodded, But the guilt didn't fade. All he could think about was how he had seen Mrs. Andrews slowly deteriorating over the past few days, and how he hadn't acted sooner. But the paramedic was right. He had done what he could now. Mrs. Andrews was being taken care of, and that was all that mattered. As the paramedics loaded Mrs. Andrews into the ambulance, John stayed where he was, still feeling a little numb from everything. He watched as the ambulance drove away, its lights flashing, and he hoped with all his heart that Mrs. Andrews would be okay. He knew he would be thinking about her every day, hoping for good news, but for now, there was nothing more he could do. The street was quiet again, but it felt different this time. It wasn't the same comforting silence he was used to. It felt heavy, like something had shifted in the air. John knew it wasn't just the house that had changed. It was him too. He had learned something important today. Sometimes, noticing the small details, the things that seem off, could save someone's life. And even though he felt a little shaken, he also felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't just his job to deliver mail. It was also his responsibility to look out for people, especially those who might need a helping hand. John turned and continued on with his route, but his thoughts kept going back to Mrs. Andrews, to the ambulance that had just pulled away. He hoped with everything in him that she would recover and be able to smile again, just like she had always done when he handed her the mail. The days after Mrs. Andrews was taken to the hospital felt long for John. He couldn't stop thinking about her, replaying the events in his mind over and over again. He had done what he thought was right by calling 911, but the guilt still weighed on him. What if he had acted sooner? What if he had asked more questions, pressed a little harder to understand what was going on? Maybe then he could have helped her earlier, before things became so serious. Every time John passed Mrs. Andrews' house, he couldn't help but glance over at it. It was so quiet now. The once lively, well-kept garden looked abandoned, with some flowers beginning to wilt. It was a stark contrast to the energetic woman who had once tended to it with so much care. John's heart sank each time he saw the empty house. He wanted to know how she was doing, but he didn't want to invade her privacy or make her feel uncomfortable. Then one morning, as he walked up to the mailbox, he saw something he didn't expect. There, standing at the front door, was Mrs. Andrews. She was leaning against the doorframe, but there she was, alive, breathing, and smiling at him. John's heart leaped in his chest. He stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide with surprise. Mrs. Andrews wasn't just standing at her door. She was smiling at him, a real smile, one he hadn't seen in days. It was a moment of pure relief. She looked tired, but she was standing on her own, looking much better than the last time he had seen her. "Mrs. Andrews," John called, almost too excitedly. She turned toward him, her eyes brightening when she saw him. "John, you're here. I've been meaning to thank you for what you did. I don't know how to say it properly, but thank you." John was at a loss for words. It wasn't often that people opened up like that, especially after such a serious event. He smiled and walked closer, relieved that she was okay. "I was just doing what anyone would have done," he said softly, feeling a bit shy under her appreciative gaze. Mrs. Andrews chuckled weakly, but with warmth. "Well, not everyone would have noticed. I'm lucky you did." John's eyes softened as he glanced at her. She still looked fragile, but there was a fire in her that hadn't been there before. It was clear that she was still recovering, but seeing her standing there, in front of her house, was enough to ease some of the guilt that had been eating away at him. She wasn't just surviving. She was determined to get back to living. The two of them talked for a few moments, and Mrs. Andrews told him about her time in the hospital. The doctors had been able to treat her stroke, and while she still had a long road to recovery, she was doing much better. She spoke with a sense of gratitude that John hadn't heard from her before. It was humbling to hear her speak so openly about her experience, and John couldn't help but feel proud that he had been the one to notice when something was wrong. As their conversation continued, John felt his worries begin to lift. Mrs. Andrews was strong. She had always been strong, And now she was proving it once again. He could tell that, though she had a long way to go, she would get through this, just as she had overcome other challenges in her life. Before leaving, John gave her a simple promise. "I'll check in on you from time to time, just to make sure everything's going well." Mrs. Andrews smiled warmly, the familiar twinkle in her eye returning. "I would appreciate that, John. Thank you." As John walked away from her house that day, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. The guilt was still there, but it was fading, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. He had been part of something important. He had made a difference in someone's life. And that was all that mattered. A few weeks passed, and John's routine as the neighborhood mailman slowly returned to normal. The days had begun to feel lighter, especially with the comforting thought that Mrs. Andrews was recovering. It wasn't that everything was completely fine. He knew she still had a long road ahead, but seeing her out of the hospital and back in her own home, even if she wasn't quite as energetic as before, gave John hope. Every time he walked past her house, he could see the small changes. The flowers in her garden were starting to bloom again, the grass had been mowed, and little by little, Mrs. Andrews was returning to the things that had once filled her days. There was no doubt in John's mind that she was working hard to regain her strength. Her spirit, though, seemed stronger than ever. It was something John admired deeply. How someone could go through such a challenge and still find the will to keep going. One morning, John had just finished his route and was walking back to the mail truck when he saw Mrs. Andrews sitting on her porch. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft, golden glow on everything around them. She looked up and waved as he approached, and John smiled back, feeling a rush of warmth from the connection they had built over the past few weeks. "Good morning, John." Mrs. Andrews greeted him, her voice still soft but more lively than it had been before. "I wanted to thank you again for everything." John paused at the edge of the porch, his heart warming at the sight of her. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "I'm just glad you're doing better." Mrs. Andrews chuckled, though it was a little quieter than usual. "Well, I've been thinking a lot. You saved my life, you know. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't noticed that something was wrong. I might still be stuck in that house, waiting for someone else to help." John shook his head, a little embarrassed. "It wasn't just me," he said. "You helped yourself by getting the right treatment when you did." She nodded thoughtfully, looking down at her hands for a moment before meeting his eyes again. "I know," she said softly, "but it was you who saw something that no one else noticed. I think that's something special." John smiled but said nothing. The words meant more to him than he could express. He didn't see himself as anything extraordinary. He was just a mailman who had happened to be at the right place at the right time. Still, hearing Mrs. Andrews say those words made everything he had done feel worthwhile. As they sat on the porch, they talked for a while, sharing stories and small updates about the neighborhood. John learned that Mrs. Andrews had begun attending physical therapy and was getting stronger each day. She still had a long way to go, but she was determined to get back to her old self, and somehow John knew she would. Before he left, Mrs. Andrews smiled at him and said, "I may have been a little too proud before, not wanting to ask for help, but I've learned that sometimes it's okay to lean on others. I'll never forget what you did for me." John felt a swell of pride in his chest. He had made a difference in her life, not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but simply by noticing something that others had missed. He had been there when it mattered most, and that was enough. As he walked away from Mrs. Andrews' house that morning, John felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had done something meaningful, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He hadn't just delivered the mail, he had helped someone when they needed it most, and that was a reward he would always carry with him. The day seemed brighter now, and as John continued down the street, he couldn't help but smile. He had learned something important, too. Sometimes, it's the little things that matter the most. And every day, whether we realize it or not, we have the chance to make a difference.